Good morning, everyone. It's so good to see so many familiar faces in the audience. I'm Antonio Zappulla, I'm CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. It's a real pleasure to be hosting you today for the launch of the Digital News Report. And it's terrific to see how year by year, there's really a growing sense of anticipation for the findings of this report, which I think really speaks volumes to the testament and the quality of the reputation of the study, but also the reputation itself of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism that we're very proud to support. So for those of you who might not know, the Thomson Reuters Foundation has been strengthening the ecosystems of media freedom for more than 40 years around the world. We do this by using the combined power of journalism and the law by driving initiatives that scale the capacity of journalists, enhance the sustainability of independent news organizations, and strengthen the safety of media practitioners. And we do this because we believe that good journalism is essential to building free, fair, and informed societies. So every year we train and mentor about 1,000 journalists around the world. We also provide pro bono legal assistance to organizations that work to protect media freedom around the world. And we produce practical legal tools that can help journalists navigating some very deeply challenging scenarios. We also produce journalism. The Foundation's newsroom covers issues of climate change, socioeconomic inclusion, and explores the impact of technology on society. And in September, we'll be launching a new digital product called Context that is aimed at professionals and provides news and analysis that contextualize how critical issues and events affect ordinary people, society, and the environment. And so because of our work, we know, as you do, that journalism is at a turning point. Misinformation and disinformation continue to erode trust in the media. Many reputable news outlets are struggling to remain viable, and online harassment against journalists is also becoming a concerning issue. We also see how the law is increasingly being weaponized to silence independent news. So here at TRF, we are ramping up our efforts to respond to all these issues. In partnership with the Committee to Protect Journalists and Media Defense, we have established the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk that strategically coordinates the different types of support that are available to independent media outlets and journalists at risk. Specialist assistance includes urgent legal representation, ongoing support for the duration of a case, amicus briefs, and even pre-publication support. And in the next few weeks, we'll be launching TRF Filter, a tool that we developed in collaboration with Google Jigsaw to scan, filter, and document online abuse received on Twitter. TRF Filter allows journalists to block, to mute, or save comments at scale, and empowers them to continue their critical, important mission of reporting without suffering the trauma associated to online abuse. Users can create individual reports that they can store or share with third parties. And we will continue to develop this tool because we want to map trends in online harassment, and we also want to offer greater insights to users, including legal guidance. You can find more on the leaflet or on trffilter.org. But of course, today we're here to look at digital industry trends. And we all know how changing distribution and business models can give a new life to media, but can also undermine its fundamental ability to operate. To operate successfully in this space, newsrooms have many obstacles to overcome. Costs are high, talent needs to be upskilled, the environment is crowded, and we know that with the exception of very few countries, consumers are yet not ready to pay for news. And this is where the Digital News Report plays such a critical role. It's an invaluable resource to understand how consumers of news engage with our work so that we can continue to drive innovation across our newsrooms. The Thomson Reuters Foundation is proud to support the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. The Institute has become one of the world's most respected institutions, producing valuable, high-impact, and global research. And so this morning, I'm very much looking forward to delving into the findings of this year's report and to hearing from some remarkable industry leaders in the conversation that will follow. I'm sure you'll find the research insightful, and I hope they will help you in reaching even greater audiences and in shaping the future of news. Thank you.
Welcome to the launch of the 2020 Reuters Institute Digital News Report. My name is Rasmus. I'm director of the Reuters Institute and professor of political communication at the University of Oxford. We live in an age of extremes, also when it comes to some aspects of the news and media use. While many of the most commercially successful news media are doing well by primarily serving audiences that are crudely put, like me, affluent, highly educated, privileged, in many countries, white, male, and middle-aged or older. questions, I think, continue to mount around the connection between journalism and much of the public. The purpose of our research at the Reuters Institute is to ensure that reporters, editors, and news media executives, and others who care about the future of journalism can understand these trends and many others to inform how they, on the basis of their own different ideals and interests, choose to adapt to a changing environment. That's also the purpose of the 11th Digital News Report. This year, we cover well over 40 markets, which represents around half of the world's population and covers 6 continents, which lead author Nic Newman will present today before we turn over to a panel discussion featuring Alessandra Galloni, editor-in-chief of Reuters, Alison Phillips, editor of the Daily Mirror, Krishnan Guru-Murthy, the main anchor at Channel 4 News, and Atkins, the news analysis editor at the BBC. Can someone advance the slides? Oh, sorry, here we go. A reminder before we dive in of the methodology, which is based on online polling, and as such, it will tend to underrepresent traditional news behaviors such as TV, print, and radio when we talk about cross-platform behavior. It's also important to stress that in some of the markets, especially in Africa and in the case of India, the sample is representative of younger, more educated English-speaking groups, so we will try to bear that in mind as we interpret the results and compare across countries. The survey was conducted on our behalf by YouGov in January and early February 2022, so before the war in Ukraine, but we did an additional survey in 5 countries a month after the invasion to make sure we understand the impact of that. This report is supported by a range of different organizations, including the Google News Initiative, the BBC, media regulators in different countries, industry organizations, foundations, and a number of academic institutions around the world. Edelman remains a long-term and valued partner of this project, but we're also delighted to work for the first time with the Japanese national broadcaster NHK this year and with Reuters, our hosts today, who is now a formal sponsor of the report and will be hosting events here in London as well as in New York next week. I will now hand it over to Nic Newman, the lead author, who will run through the key findings this year before we turn to the panel and discussion. Over to you, Nic.
Thanks very much, Rasmus. So we now have 10 years of solid data that allows us to see some of the structural changes that have taken place in terms of weekly consumption of different news sources. And I'm going to start with the United States, and we can see over the 10 years, online is actually pretty flat. But at the same time, television news has fallen quite significantly. Primarily, that's younger people turning away from television. We also see the decline of print in that chart over the period, and radio too. But this year, we've added another line which tracks the proportion who said they consumed none of these sources of news in an average week. And you can see that that group rising from 3% in 2013 to well over 10% in 2022. These are effectively people who say they access no news at all. If we look at the United Kingdom, it's a pretty similar story over the period. So decline in traditional media, again, television and print. And we see that online and social not really making up that gap. And again, we find an increase in the proportion that say they consume none of these sources in an average week, not as much as the US, but still significant. There is another group which we identify and highlight in this report as selective news avoiders. So these are people who do consume, most of them do consume news regularly, but they also actively avoid some of the news stories some of the time. And we've been asking about this for a few years, so we've got sort of tracking data on it, and we see the numbers have been growing. So in the UK, well over 4 in 10, 46%, say they actively avoid at least some news, pretty much double the figure we saw in 2017. And the top reasons for that include too much news about certain subjects, too much politics, too much maybe about COVID-19. And around a third also talk about the news being depressing, bringing down their mood. That's particularly the case for women, and it's particularly the case for younger people too. And just bringing some of that to life with quotes from our qualitative interviews this year. So here's somebody talking about politics news, feeling her views are not really taken into account, that sort of sense of powerlessness. And then a young man worrying about the news creating anxiety or inducing anxiety, and worrying about mental health. I should stress again, our main survey took place before the war in Ukraine started, but subsequent polling showed that news avoidance has, if anything, increased, especially in some of the countries closest to the fighting, like Poland and Germany. One other reason which came out of the survey was whether news organizations were making the news too hard to follow or understand. And you can see here that this reason was disproportionately selected by younger groups in almost every country. So that's the blue line. And we also picked this up in our interviews. So young people may be finding the language used by journalists, or maybe some of the assumed knowledge, too difficult. And maybe this plays into the trend towards the sort of explainers that Ros Atkins, who's going to be on our panel, does, answering questions more, and also more accessible formats. Our data suggests that there's still some way to go in making the news accessible. If we turn now to trust, and last year we had some good news. We saw a bit of a bounce in trust figures, partly because of COVID. This year we see a partial reverse, so figures down in almost half of our markets, up in only 7 of them. But again, a huge amount of variation across countries and within regions even. So you have 69% who say they trust the news most of the time in Finland, but just half of that in the UK, 34%. And actually in the UK, trust has fallen 16 percentage points since the Brexit referendum. And at the bottom there on the right, you'll see the United States trust has fallen another 3 percentage points there to 26% who say they trust most news most of the time. That's the lowest in our survey, along with Slovakia. Of course, there's lots of reasons for low trust, and this chart just reminds us how much trust in the media can be affected by politics and by levels of polarization in society. So we're looking here at trust over time figures in the US, and we're splitting that by political allegiance. So people who self-identify on the left, in the pink, actually have a reasonable amount of trust. That's pretty close to the global average. But people on the right, in the blue, have far less trust. So just 14% say they trust most news most of the time, and that maybe helps to explain why that stolen election narrative got and still has so much traction with so many people in the US. We can compare that with the UK. Here we see that decline I talked about earlier in media trust from both left and right since Brexit for different reasons. And then especially during the election of 2019. And we talked about this last year, these perceptions that the media is seen as not being fair to one side or the other. So now turning to that question of the business of journalism, and we continue to track the proportion paying for online news in around 20 countries where the idea of news subscription, news membership, or donations are well understood. And again, we see here quite wide variations. So at one end, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, strong tradition of subscription. The United States, 19% say they pay for some news in the last year. And then much lower levels in France, in Japan, in the United Kingdom, just 9%. We have seen some significant growth in some countries. So in Germany, up 5 percentage points. Same in Australia and Sweden also. But elsewhere, the growth seems to have leveled off a bit, and some declines in some countries. So overall, the average of 17% is unchanged from last year. As in previous years, we asked respondents to tell us which brands they were subscribing to or which brands they were providing ongoing donations to. And as in previous years, we find this winner takes most dynamic, with a few big national newspapers accounting for a significant proportion of those paying. But interestingly, in a few markets, we do see local news taking a bigger proportion. So in Norway, for example, around half pay for a local publication, but much, much lower in markets like the UK and Portugal, where the value proposition is not seen as being so great. In most markets, the majority pay for just one news subscription. The majority of payers just pay for one news subscription. But we do find that in the US and in Australia, we now find more than half subscribing to more than one publication. So that may be a national newspaper and a local one, for example, or some other combination, maybe a news magazine like The Atlantic, or we also picked up Apple News coming through strongly in the US, even Twitter Blue, or an individual journalist now, quite often operating an email via Substack and asking people to pay for it. For the first time this year, we asked about those payments to individual journalists to see how significant that was. We do find in the US, we find 7% of subscribers are paying for these kind of newsletters. But just to put that in context, that is a fraction of those paying for mainstream media brands, even in the US, and it's much lower elsewhere, as you can see. Now, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the wider subscription ecosystem and whether people might be thinking of rationalizing this given the cost of living crisis. So we wanted to look at this in a bit more detail this year in the report. This chart just gives a sort of sense of the picture in the UK. So the bigger blobs on the left there, about 3/4 have a subscription to one or more TV streaming services. Many have 2 or 3. A significant proportion have a music subscription, then you have audiobooks, and then sports, and then finally news with the smallest proportion overall. The demographic profile is also really interesting. So TV and music really skewing much younger, and actually news is the only media subscription that appeals more to older customers. In the UK, the vast majority of subscribers, 92%, are over 30. We asked people directly if they were thinking of cutting or taking out more media subscriptions this year, including TV, music or news, and actually the results we found were pretty evenly split. But that in January was before the cost of living crisis really hit. But even then, we found people explicitly saying that they would be cancelling subscriptions, media subscriptions, and including news ones. On the other hand, we also heard people saying that at times like these, at times of crisis, having reliable news sources are more important than ever. So clearly there are forces pushing in both directions here. This year we've also been looking at the extent to which different groups identify more with news brands or with individual journalists. And we find across our 46 markets surprisingly wide variation on this question, with people paying most attention to brands in countries like Finland and Denmark, as well as the UK. But people in the United States, Brazil, for example, identifying much more strongly with those individual journalists. And to understand a little bit more about which journalists are paying attention to online, we asked respondents this year to fill in an open field in the survey. And these are the results from the UK. So with the best known journalists tending to work for public service broadcasters or national news brands who have a duty to report news impartially, and then a range of journalists from our very strong print brands in the UK. And it's nice to see the BBC, Channel 4, and the Mirror from our panelists here represented on this chart. But it's a very different story in the United States. So here we see that list dominated by the stars of cable TV news, Tucker Carlson at the top. And much of that content, of course, is opinion-focused rather than based on evidence and facts. This data, again, illustrates, I think, differences in how much people in different countries are exposed to partisan opinions, as well as, I think, the continuing importance of TV and radio personalities as they now develop a strong presence online as well and via social media. Every year we ask respondents how they access news online. Where do they start their journey? And using data from all countries about main gateways, in this chart we see that majority access is via side door routes such as search and social media. Though of course some of those searches will be for branded news sites. But nevertheless, every year we see the proportion that says they mainly access directly going down and the indirect routes going up. This chart plots those preferences to go directly in the blue against main access via social media. Main access via social media is in blue over time. And again, this is using all country data. And we can see we've kind of reached that tipping point with social media now edging ahead. A very important caveat, though, is it's very, very different in different countries. So those high trust, strong brand countries still have that direct connection. But other countries like Thailand, Philippines, and Kenya, we see much more indirect traffic, social media being much more important. And much of this shift away from direct access to news websites is being driven by actually the very youngest demographic, a group we're calling social natives, so 18 to 24s. What we're looking at on this chart is in the UK, direct preferences. Do you prefer to go directly to a news website or app? We can see that the 25 to 34s and the 35 pluses haven't really changed their preferences very much over the period, over the last 7 years. But it's very different for those 18 to 24s, those social natives. As they come into adulthood, you can see that they are having a much weaker connection to those brands. And the reason for that, of course, is the greater amount of time that they are spending within social networks, within messaging apps. When looking at 1824s specifically and the networks they use for any purposes, again, this is the UK, we can see that decline in Facebook from about 2018, accompanied by a rise in WhatsApp and, of course, Instagram. And then just in the last couple of years, the emergence of TikTok. TikTok, of course, is now is extremely fast growing. It's the fastest growing network for news in our survey this year. And of course, it's got a lot of attention during the Ukraine conflict. Traditional brands like the BBC, Channel 4, increasingly represented alongside influencers and ordinary people. And across countries, 40% of under 25s use TikTok for any purpose, 15% for news. And across all ages, those figures are much higher now in Africa, parts of Asia, and Latin America. That's where the growth is happening fastest. In our comments, we find some people find the presentation appealing, the algorithm incredibly addictive. That's one of the thing that's driving this. But interestingly, not everyone thinks TikTok is the future of news. You'll be pleased to hear. Here's somebody recognizing the limitations of short-form videos on both TikTok and Instagram as a way to tell stories, and at least this 18-year-old is looking for more professionalism. So here are some takeaways. Just a recap, in a number of countries we see a significant proportion now disconnecting from news, or at least selectively avoiding certain stories that might bring down their mood. That's obviously a challenge for media companies in how to engage audiences across age groups with important stories. Trust is down in most countries, partly reversing the gains made during the COVID crisis. Online payment is up in some countries, slowing down in others, with the biggest brands still benefiting most, and with rising concerns about the possible impact of the cost of living crisis. Social media is an increasingly compelling gateway for news for many people, especially the young, and that process is accelerating. And finally, Facebook is still the #1 social network for news, but we see newer networks like Instagram and TikTok gaining ground. And with that summary, I hand you back to Rasmus. Spread out.
So I really want to start with one of the things that Nic highlighted in his recap towards the end, which is the issue of news avoidance. We find here in the UK that almost half of the people we interview say that they at least sometimes or even often try to actually avoid the news on purpose. And the most commonly named reason is that it brings down their mood. 36% of those who say they actually avoid the news identify this. Others say it leads to news. News leads to arguments they'd rather avoid, or feelings of powerlessness. I wonder, Alison, when you think about this as an editor, do you feel there's anything that journalists need to do differently to avoid or mitigate these feelings? And if so, what are some of the things that you're thinking about in the mirror?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been, is that working? Yeah, I've always been really conscious of this. I think throughout my time as an editor now, because I think this might sound terribly gender stereotyped, because I think this has been an issue, quite a big issue for women for a very long time. But perhaps as society is changing, I think it's becoming more of an issue for across the gender divide. And so, and I think there's various different reasons for it. I think there's the sense of powerlessness, in that the problems are so big, and we felt this quite acutely during COVID. The problems are so big, particularly at the beginning, that there didn't seem to be any obvious way of solving it. And then there's that sort of also that sensation that people feel quite small and insignificant. and the news can be depressing. So we look at that in a kind of a range of ways. So the first thing is by explaining what's going on really, really clearly. So that's the first point. Because once you understand something, it's slightly less bewildering and slightly less depressing. And you can see, okay, so this has happened because of that. Because it's when things happen and people don't understand the why that they immediately feel on the back foot. And then the second point then is to really tell real people's stories at that point. So again, if you've got facts and figures and reports and this and that, again, it's all sort of quite overwhelming. And but of course, the key to great sort of tabloid journalism as we have is always been telling any complicated issue. But if you're telling it through a real person's experience, again, it's far more relatable. It's far less overwhelming and depressing. And then the third point is then to sort of show solutions to any sort of situation. So quite often we'll do something. So this awful thing's happening here, but in quite often Scandinavia or whatever, this is a solution, or this is what this particular town is doing to cope with antisocial behaviour, whatever. So that wherever there are these overwhelming problems, you think there can be solutions, and it gives people that sort of hope. And then last year we launched something called Mirror More Hopeful, which was a commitment to doing more hopeful news, which you always run that risk, particularly amongst all the hardcore youth reporters, that, oh, you're going a bit sort of soft, it's all sort of, rainbows and unicorns. But I think it's ensuring that within our coverage, we are finding the nuggets of hope, which always exist, and making sure that we share them with our readers.
If anyone ever sees a story about unicorns in the Mirror, please do let me know. I'd be very interested to see that. Krishnan, at Channel 4, you have a sort of special obligation to ensure that news reaches and serves a more diverse audience than perhaps some other organisations in the UK. How do you think about an issue like news avoidance and these sort of emotions that people have that seems to lead them to avoid the news at least some of the time?
I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on. I think we can all understand why people would say, yes, I avoid the news, it's too grim. Even I have avoided the news on times. But I actually think what's going on is viewers are now very sophisticated and very discerning. Gone are the days where people have to open a newspaper or turn on the TV to find out what happened today. So they watch the news when they know that there is news to understand and to analyse and to question and to hold to account. And when they know that there is no news, they don't bother because they've looked at the website that they choose, whether it's the BBC or the Guardian or whatever it might be. They've gone, there's nothing very much going on today. I can go outside, or I can see my friends, or whatever it is. Don't need to turn on the telly. I think in terms, but I think actually people overstate it. So I mean, our experience in the first half of this year is that our audiences are up year on year in absolute volume and share. So in fact, I think of the public service bulletins, the only bulletins that are up on absolute volume numbers are Channel 4 News and Newsnight, which I think is very interesting. Lots of bulletins are up on share. But I think what that tells you is that people want more of what Alison's talking about. They want to understand the news. They don't want to feel something as just powerlessly grim. They don't want an avalanche of death and destruction about which they don't understand, feel powerless to do anything about, and see no hope. So I think in-depth analysis, there's always been a myth that young people aren't interested in in-depth. It's total rubbish. Started my career in Newsround, the children's news programme. We always used to do background explainers, so the kinds of things that Roz has made famous today, we were doing actually for adult audiences on Newsround as well, because when I was doing it, we were on at 5 o'clock in the evening, and we used to have more adult viewers than children. And they didn't understand the 6 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news or Channel 4 news. So they used to watch Newsround explainers to work out what the hell the war in Yugoslavia was really about. So I think giving people context is really, really important. And I think also, we can all do things a bit better. So I think sort of thinking about news the way Alison was talking about, in terms of, it's not, because there are some stories about which you as a viewer, you can do nothing, basically. I can't empower you as a viewer to do anything about, a famine in Yemen right now, beyond changing world politics and all those sorts of things. But I can tell you what people are doing on the ground. So and there are always nuggets of hope. There are always people trying to change the world. There are always people trying to deliver progress. So I think if, there's a danger of sort of 2-minute reports on a news bulletin just being it's all grim, we're all going to die, it's all awful. I totally understand why you wouldn't want to watch But if you can give people a little bit more and a little bit more understanding and a little bit more understanding of why there might be hope, why there might be grounds for change, what history tells you about this, who you can hold to account for what they're getting wrong, then they are a lot more interested. And I think actually I'm delighted with this report because it confirms a lot of what we've been feeling, which is actually if you look at the trust scores, I think what this is a clarion call for high quality, in-depth, impartial broadcast news. And what it tells you is that people don't want shouty opinion. They want, the fact is that if you look at the trust scores, Channel 4, ITV News and BBC News are on about 54, 55%, 20% ahead of the overall trust score for news. And opinionated news, shouty news, people aren't interested. There's a great myth that this is the future of news. Look at the American trust scores. They are basically flat from 2015 on because trust is on the floor in America because all they get is shouty, opinionated news. We don't want it here.
I'll turn to trust next, and I'd love to hear from Ross and Alessandra on this in particular. But before that, Krishnan, what you described, I think, is a world in which, as users, our demand for news is quite dynamic and quite reliant on sort of what happens in the world and our own situation. But if you flip around and look at it from your position as an editor, would it be fair to say that we're still pretty supply-driven and there just happens to be the same amount of news in the world every day? We do the same length bulletins, same number of stories on the website, that is sort of quite standardized production. Do you see that changing going forward? Is there going to be a greater variation in the supply side?
Well, actually, I don't think it's necessarily true of the last few years. One of my criticisms of news at the moment, and really since the pandemic, is that we've become single-story news. We've been obsessed with great detail and depth, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why people say they avoid the news as well, of just COVID, just Partygate, just Ukraine. And it was before that, just Brexit, just the Northern Ireland Protocol, whatever it might be. And I think that is a turn-off. To my mind, actually we've lost quite a lot of the variety and diversity in news stories, and that's partly also a result of resource going out of high-quality news, where we simply can't afford to send as many people around the world to different stories today as we perhaps used to. So actually, we are trying to buck that at Channel 4 News, is all I can tell you. We are trying to stick to our remit, which is to cover the world. We're leading tonight on a story from Mogadishu, not the refugee story about Rwanda, and I think people want that kind of sense of they're getting something different and they're getting some variety. So I hope it's not just the same, and I hope actually it will get better than it has been for the last 3 years, because I think the last 3 years have been a bit of a low for news diversity.
I mean, as Krishnan says, there are clearly some brands, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, a few others who do sort of beat the market in terms of trust. But I wonder, Russ, what we see in this year's report is that after last year's sort of COVID-related bump in trust, trust in news has gone down again, especially it's quite low here in the UK, just 34% that they feel they can trust most news most of the time. How, from your perspective, do you think journalists can do anything to change these numbers?
So my main approach to the work we're doing at the BBC at the moment is to not assume anyone's going to watch and not assume anyone's going to trust me. So even though I'm working for BBC News, and in some ways I had a head start in terms of trust because of our brand and our relationship with the audiences, I don't automatically assume that therefore as a BBC journalist people are going to trust what I'm saying. And as such, if you watch a lot of the work that I'm doing, I place evidence alongside every assertion that I make. So I'm not saying, I'm just going to tell you this because I'm from the BBC and you're going to trust me. I'm going to say, this has happened and here's the evidence. This is our analysis and here's the evidence. And if you watch the videos we make, I'm constantly providing evidence, not at some later point, but juxtaposed right next to whatever I'm asserting. And that is partly because I want to constantly earn your trust by saying, this is the reason I'm telling you this. And that's proved very, very effective. Another thing is to be available and open. So if you're placing your journalism into digital environments, then you need to be willing to engage with people who question why you've said what you've said and go back to them and say, well, here is the evidence. And that's a never-ending process, of course. And the other thing I would say is that you need to I also don't approach it in terms of, I'm a news guy making some news for you. I'm trying to make something that's helpful, because some people come to the BBC because they think, I want to know what the news is, but other people will be on social media or different digital environments because they're looking for a whole bunch of different things. They're not necessarily just there for news. And for me, I need to make journalism that works in that environment as well. So again, if you look at the stuff we've got going in the last few years, I've largely stripped out all of the language of TV news out of it. And I'm saying, here's some useful information, hopefully well told. But for those of you who don't feel a connection with more classic TV news, sometimes we're sending signals as legacy news organizations that this is journalism and this is this form of journalism. Print does it in ways as well. And it's really important to me that we consider that while some of our audience are comfortable with those signals and like it, actually those signals say to a lot of people, this isn't for me. And so one of the ways that I've tried to build trust is we think about the way that our journalism manifests itself and the way that it is received by the audience. And all of these calculations all build up to hopefully, having a trusting relationship. Can I just pick up on one other thing, because it's really important? You were asking about, is there just an equal amount of news every day? Newsrooms, all newsrooms we work on have routines. Krishnan and I will know this. We have to make a program at the end of the day every day, whatever. Actually, one of the most powerful things we've been experimenting with on a small scale, along with colleagues who work on our videos and on outside sources, much greater flexibility. The willingness to not make something. I know it seems ridiculous to talk about, say I'm going to not make something. It's been one of the most powerful things we've experimented with in the last 2 years, is to not do it, to save what you want to do until what you've got is of maximum utility. And that is something which I think does not come easily to newsrooms which are machines pushing out news every day. The ability to turn it up and turn it down is not as established as it could be, I think. And in the digital world, I think you need to be able to flex much better than classically we've constructed our news processes.
Just don't do it. I'm going to get sneakers with that.
Can I just pick up on one very
I
brief
want
thing
to turn
from
to
that
Alessandra
position?
on the issue of trust, because Alessandra, Reuters has a huge commitment to trustworthy on-the-ground reporting. You've got thousands of reporters around the world doing indispensable on-the-ground reporting. You also have the trust principles informing your work and much more. But a news agency is also in a slightly different position from the one that Ross described, or Krishnan describes, in that you don't have the same direct relationship with the people who rely on your journalism. How do you think about this issue of trust at Reuters, and in particular this erosion we see in some countries?
Yeah. So, well, yeah, as you said, I think that's an important distinction to make. We hope that we are trusted, with our customers, so with all of you. Though of course we are also, while we serve sort of from the source, we serve both our customers who are other news organizations and a financial audience through a financial terminal. We are building actually a professional business, which is sort of more of a direct to consumer or direct to professional business. I think the link is something that was just said, which is useful information. And I think the link between the sort of bridge between engagement and trust is useful information. It is key both to having trust and key to having people engaged. And I think COVID taught us a lot in that, and you and I have spoken about this clearly. When it comes to news that is important for your life, whether that be health information or whether sort of in our business, and certainly for our financial audience, news that you make or lose money with, then suddenly it becomes news that you need, not just news that you want. And I think that's a key area. So now, for example, how fast we're going to get to a recession, how high inflation is going to get. That is information that people, they need to know, and therefore they want to know. And I was saying to somebody just before that I was at an event yesterday with hundreds of high school students, and they were very engaged on economic issues. It was interviews with financial institutions, with central banks, and they wanted to know what the answers were to these questions. A couple of things. one is, I think perhaps what's changed is the angle. So for example, on financial news, you'll find that younger audiences want certain angles. So how is the financial industry dealing with climate change, or with sustainability issues? So perhaps the angle through which engagement increases is different than the traditional one. Sorry if that's me, I apologize. Tony, help. And then the other quick thing is sort of formats. Obviously, formats are changing the how of delivering news. And I think that's very important because clearly news is being consumed in a different way. I wonder whether these numbers don't reflect one aspect, which I think about all the time when I sort of see kind of, younger people interacting with my kids. They seem to be informed. And yet when you ask them, how do you consume news? You say, well, I don't consume news. And yet they know what's going on. So somehow they are getting their news. But just to come back to trust, I think obviously trust is up to us. Spoken about this, we've spoken about this before, but I think especially at a time when, trust in the media is once again low, there are things you can do that journalists can do, which is, get your facts straight. And crucially, I'm not going to go into a lesson in journalism here, but crucially, when you make a mistake, be transparent about it and correct it. And again and again, and still now we see that is a real key to the world, trusting or not trusting, not just the media, by the way, politicians, banks, admit when you got something wrong. I just had this very conversation this morning with my 10-year-old. So
We can all learn a lot from. I want to follow up on one point that you highlighted, Alessandra, which is the idea of news that we may or may not want, but that we need to make informed decisions, to live the lives that we aspire to protect ourselves and our loved ones, and sort of take part in the way in which the society governs itself. For that news to be there needs to be a sustainable business of news. And increasingly there, people are looking at pay models. But there's also, I think, a question of sort of equity and inclusion. Not everyone is in a position to pay for news. Not everyone will find that the news they're being offered is worth paying for. I'd love to hear some views on this from the panelists, from you, from Alison. I know the Mirror, occupies a special role in this respect as well in the UK. What do you think about that sort of tension between pay and inclusion when it comes to news?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that it costs money to deliver quality news. That is just a fact. And I think that Ukraine is a perfect example. It costs money to keep journalists in Ukraine and to keep them safe. And, we are fortunate in that we have an infrastructure, a safety infrastructure, a legal infrastructure, an operations infrastructure that can allow us to cover Ukraine. And we saw, most of the news that is being consumed from Ukraine is video news, is live images, obviously, as you would expect in a conflict. Well, delivering video news, you all know, far better than I, but it is a very infrastructure-heavy business, and keeping people safe with safety consultants who are on the ground with them is, and being able to airlift them out if you need to, having armored vehicles, all of that costs money. So I realize there is a tension, but it's just the reality of our business.
How do you think about this, Alison?
Well, I think one of the more worrying aspects, I think, of the numbers that we were looking at earlier from Nic, is the line about people who have paid for subscriptions. So, and I think as you referenced at the beginning, if you are kind of a middle-aged, wealthy professional, there's quite a lot of access to high-quality news out there. So obviously something like the Mirror, which has always occupied historically the sort of the mass market, traditionally our readers may not be university educated. We have a huge number, comparative to our competitors, of black readers and people from ethnic minorities. So my concern is, if the trend continues towards subscriptions for news, what happens to those people for whom either they can't afford it, particularly the monetary pressures at the moment, or it's not quite that much of a priority? They probably could afford it if they really scraped around for the money, but actually they'd probably rather have Sky Sports. So, and of course, traditionally, when you had a curated product like a print product, they had all the sports reports they needed, and they had the stars, and they had the recipe of the day, and they had really high quality news. So I've always, something like the Mirror, you could pick up at any day and you would find exactly what was going on across the world, as well as having all the entertainment. And of course now we're moving into that area where for democracy, how do we ensure that people are well informed and have got that role to play within a functioning democracy, but at minimum cost, and until that we find that is going to be the challenge.
Krishnan, you had something you wanted to pick up on, and then I'll ask some people for some views on the findings around social media, and then I'll open up for questions as well. We've got a lot of really smart people in the room, so I want to hear from other people than those who are on the stage. But Krishnan, you had something.
Well, I was just going to briefly mention the question about repetition, particularly of politics, and why actually it is important that we do continue to talk about these things and are not just simply influenced by people are getting bored, let's do something else. Let's do something easy. If we hadn't carried on going on and on about the inconsistencies with the Northern Ireland Protocol in the build-up to those negotiations, we would not now be able to say to our viewers and to the world, well, we did point all of this out to politicians. We did hold them to account on what they were negotiating. We pointed out the problems. And it's very, very important that we all did that there's a record of that. So I think, we mustn't be too put off survey evidence and change the nature of what we do and the importance of what we do for democracy. Just in terms of sort of paywall, I speak to a lot of students in schools, go around a lot of schools and ask them always at the beginning, how do you get your news? What do you watch? And obviously, huge numbers of them get the news from social media now. But they do also get their news from the free websites, the news websites. So, they always call out the BBC, the Guardian, the Daily Mail, and I do worry that some news brands who are now demanding subscription, they're gambling that young people are going to one day want to pay for news, and we've no idea in truth whether they will or not. I can't see my 17-year-old going from checking Apple News to suddenly paying for news anytime soon. And so I think it brings you back to this question of trusted news brands. If you don't have critical mass in terms of eyes on your product over a period of time, you will lose trust. And so what are now traditional legacy trusted news brands could find themselves in the future without an audience and without that deep level of trust in what they're pumping out.
Well, she looked like a man with a thought.
Well, I'm quite interested in Krishnan's point here that the stuff Nic was outlining is fascinating and really important. But sometimes I fear that journalists look at the description of a situation and we can draw the wrong conclusion. And some of the work that we've been doing at the BBC was really drawn out of the fact that in 2019 I was looking at what I was doing. It wasn't really working at all in the digital space. And I could have concluded that's just because it can't. But we took another run at it and we actually managed to come up with a product that's proved very, very popular. And if you'd said I could do an 8-minute code, or 8-minute video on the ministerial code that would go viral, you'd think, well, that's not possible. But actually, if you do it in a certain way, maybe it is. And so I don't think we should feel defeated by this data. I think it's a challenge for journalists to go, all right, well, this is the situation we're dealing with. This is the market we're dealing with. Perhaps we need to change the way our journalism manifests itself rather than conclude that journalism full stop cannot work in these different environments. And that's why, and Rasmus has heard me say this before, that I think we need to go back to the format that our journalism takes and ask some really profound questions about it, because all four of us in our different ways are emphasizing utility, context, explanation, depth. All of these things we've got proof have value. How many of our journalism distribution mechanisms and formats allow for those things? How many rules do we all set ourselves that actually stories have to be this length, or videos have to be this length, or TV programs have to be made this way? If we don't go back to the fundamental rules of the game and say, maybe they're constraining us, you're always going to have problems coming up with formats that cater to some of the issues outlined by Nic. And so I think inevitably journalists focus on what's the story, and then you think, well, how am I going to do the story today? But I think as news organizations, we have to take a step back from that and look at the structures by which we set the rules for our journalists, because if you don't change them, they're not going to be able to fundamentally change the kind of journalism they're doing.
I mean, I wanted to follow up, Ross, and I'll want to hear from other panelists on this too before we open up. But sort of two big things that Nick highlighted is one part of it is the continuing move towards people relying more on various forms of intermediary search, social aggregators for how they access and find news. Another part of it is the expectations that people have about how journalists carry themselves in those environments. Are they there to share and report the news on those platforms? Are they also expressing personal opinions of various sorts, including perhaps political ones? Can you share a little bit more with us about how you've thought about that, working with your team at the BBC, those two issues?
Well, the latter point's very easy. I'm not going to be sharing any opinions on social media, so that didn't require very much, many conversations at all. We don't do that at the BBC. I don't have any aspirations to do it. And actually, one of the interesting things for me is that sometimes people come up and they say, do you find impartiality a constraint? And I always say it doesn't feel constraining to me. It feels to me like a strength. It's a point of difference. When we are entering the digital arena where there's a huge amount of heat, a huge amount of opinion, actually being someone who's divorced from that and who's calmer and saying, let me help you through all of this, that's a helpful point of difference.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do your earlier career journalists feel the same way?
You'd have to ask them, I think.
I may ask you the same.
I think it's changed in truth, hasn't it?
I don't know.
In that, you've got to sort of separate opinion from personality. I think on social media, we're all used to showing a bit of personality and a bit of ourselves. But you don't want to cross the line, in my view, into opinion as a news person, because even though Twitter isn't part of the regulated space in the way that television is, or radio, I think all of us in broadcast have basically settled on a position in different forms and different codes of conduct, which is that basically don't say on Twitter what you wouldn't say on the TV. And that's a simple rule.
But
You were about to say a second point. I
No,
interrupted you.
but the point about opinion, I suppose, is the degree to how you are positioning your news brand and how you're positioning your personal brand in those spaces. Now, for the BBC and for me as a BBC journalist, that's clearly built around impartiality and fairness across the piece. If I start sharing opinions, one of the reasons my products are popular is immediately undercut. It's completely ruined. I lose that trust which we've been building up bit by bit. So for me, it's not an attractive option, but clearly there are many journalists out there who share their opinions and have plenty to say. I can't actually remember what my second point was.
But how do you think about that yourself, Alison? I mean, we find that around half of our respondents, in some countries more than that, say that they would prefer journalists to stick to sharing the news and reporting the news on social. But there is a significant minority, often amongst younger people, who say they're fine with journalists sharing their personal opinions. And as you say, there might be journalists who would like to share their personal opinions, perhaps particularly
But there isn't
the ones. How do you think about that in your newsroom?
No, go ahead. I think you
No,
were
go
gonna
ahead.
make
Sorry.
some-
Sorry.
Well, no, I totally agree with you. I mean, we at Reuters, certainly like the BBC, perhaps even more so, because again, we are actually serving, the bulk of our business is serving, all of you and a financial audience. We certainly don't give opinion. We don't have any opinion. We have financial commentary, and that is about as far as we stray into opinion. And so, the consumer aspect and what they want is just one aspect of it. But I find that it's a huge theme in newsrooms now. Earlier career journalists in particular want to be names. And so they want to go out there and they want to be part of the discourse. And there's also the aspect is they want news organizations that have what they call moral clarity. And this leads them to go onto the Twitter sphere and express, if not their views, beyond what they have written or said, or in video or shot with on a photo, and that is a problem. It's an issue that I think we have to deal with. Not just us. The Washington Post has just had a major kerfuffle, over this very issue. We say the same thing. We tell our journalists, if just caveat emptor. We obviously are purveyors of free speech. We don't want to curtail free speech, but realize that what you put on Twitter today will stay there forever. 2, think about what your credibility in continuing your job is going to be if people know, how you feel about one thing, or another. And see, in many cases, do people know you as you, or do people know you as Reuters? And therefore, think about what you just wrote. If it were a headline of a newspaper, how would you feel about it? But and we try to talk things through, but the pressure exists.
But they're also different. I mean, clearly there are different models in that some journalists whose opinions are very well known are creating journalism aimed at a target audience. We've just seen the American list. All those people, Rachel Maddow, Tucker Carlson, and everyone else, they know who they're talking to and they're talking straight to them. Fine, that's working for them. For me, it would be, aside from the fact I'm not allowed to do it and don't want to do it, it's also just not a good idea for the popularity of my journalism, because the moment you start expressing opinions in one direction, you are likely to lose a significant part of the market that you could reach. And at the BBC, we're obviously trying to reach everyone, and so to start expressing opinions would likely undercut the very popularity that we're seeking out. So it doesn't make good business sense apart from all the other reasons.
And that's why in America the BBC scores higher than the ABC on trust.
Alison, years of rigorous research has led me to hold the view that sometimes the Mirror has opinions about the debate. But this is just a hypothesis at this stage. How do you think about this in terms of how the Mirror and your newsroom and your journalists carry themselves in social media?
Yeah, well, I mean, as Ross says, that his sort of USP is to be completely objective and to look at it, whereas we are a left-leaning, mass-market newsroom, and our USP is to be that left of centre, because there is no one else. You know, you've got the Guardian, but it's an entirely different kind of audience. So, and we've built on that for many, many years. But having said all of that, some of our most, I mean, Pippa Carrera was there on the top 10 most recognised journalists, who our political editor, and she digitally is very careful not to use opinion. So she'll report the news, and obviously she's there because she's done so well on all the Partygate stories in recent months. So that's kind of shown the power of just, you know, pure play journalism. But I think in this country, particularly in the kind of the heritage print brands, which are now operating in digital space, there is an expectation that they come with a political standpoint. And rightly or wrongly, that's just kind of the way it's developed over many, many years. And, you know, we obviously have broadcast which is more impartial. And with a lot of those kind of heritage news brands, it's very much a kind of like being part of a club, or certainly was, or being, it's like a lifestyle choice. You know, you're a Telegraph reader, or you're a Mirror reader, or you're a Sun reader, and that's it's so much about you as a person beyond actually just the news that you are getting in that vehicle. And so I think that's sort of obviously changing as we move into digital, where individual journalists are becoming names in themselves. But I still think most people in this country, they understand inherently what being a Telegraph reader or a Sun reader or a Mirror reader says about you. And they're actually kind of things that people have felt quite comfortable with, give them a sense of belonging. Quite often I've felt that being a Mirror reader is being part of, you're part of a club which just so happens to bring out a daily news feed. So.
Wonderful. We have another club here of very interesting and smart people in the room, and I want to make sure that people have a chance to ask questions as well. So we'll open it up here. Got two rowing mics at the back. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please raise your hand. Identify yourself and direct the question at one of the panelists or at Nick, and we'll try to get in as many questions as we can.
Thank you, Jonathan Hayward from the Public Interest News Foundation. So, you know, we're very inspired by the work that all of you are doing. It's fantastic. Big national news brands with huge resources may not feel like it every day, but compared to the small independent news providers in the UK, truly huge resources at your disposal. At Public Interest News Foundation, we're working with an emerging sector of 200 or 300 very small independents, whether they're local, investigative, or speaking by and for particular communities based on identity. And they typically have turnover in the tens of thousands or the low hundreds of thousands. And what we're looking to is the States, where we see sites like that having built up turnover in the millions or tens of millions of dollars, largely with support from philanthropy. So in the UK, we turn to our philanthropists, people who care about social justice, racial justice, climate justice, diversity, equality, inclusion. And we say, hey, there's a huge crisis and there's an opportunity to support independent journalism towards those objectives. And they say, journalism? Really? That's part of the problem. There is not an instinctive sense among UK philanthropists that journalism is part of the solution. They, compared to the States, where there's hundreds of millions of dollars flowing in, we have this huge cultural obstacle. And it's not thanks to you guys, you're the good guys, but there is an overarching perception that journalism is harmful, it's extractive, exploitative, and overwhelmingly political and commercial in character. How are we going to change that perception?
I mean, Ross, I'm going to hand this one to you, not because of the funding model, but because of something you said that I thought in a way addresses Jonathan's point, which is that I think the profession and the industry sometimes has been at risk of assuming that they had a sort of a born right to the attention and deference of the public, and that everyone saw journalism the way journalism would like to see itself as a public good. But it's pretty obvious from our research and much other research that that's not at all the way the public sees journalism much of the time, and frankly, it's not the way that philanthropists see journalism much of the time. So, you know, how from your point of view can journalism sort of convince not just a skeptical public, but perhaps also other actors in society of its value?
Well, I think first of all you have to accept that needs to be done. So I go to quite a few journalism events where journalists seem reasonably fed up that we're not all being celebrated as being fantastic, and that our great value is very obvious to us. It's just no one else has picked up on that. I think we need to drop that and understand that a lot of people don't see the value in what we're doing. A lot of people don't even understand what we're doing. Why should they understand what journalistic values are or journalistic processes are? I don't know what the detailed processes are of lots of other industries. There's no reason why consumers of our product should understand what we do whatsoever. So when I'm making journalism, I'm starting from the point of view of I'm going to have to demonstrate why you can trust this information, and I'm going to have to demonstrate why there are processes underneath this so you can trust this information, and it's going to have to be really good to consume. I can't assume that people are just going to go, this worthy information, I'll have that, yes please. It's going to have to be watchable or readable, and I need to take those things seriously. And as such, and it might seem a bit strange talking as someone who works for one of the biggest news organizations on the world, I pretty much start anything I do from the basis it's not going to work. Like, I'm working on the basis that I'm going to have to work very hard to make it a success. I'm going to have to work hard to make the case that it has value, that it should be popular, that it should be shared, that you should read or watch to the end. I'm not doing that from a point of pessimism. I'm just working on the basis that these are things journalists need to have in their mind. They can't assume that the value is understood, and the hope has to be, and surely we can believe this, otherwise we wouldn't all be in this industry, that if you do those things and people do get to the end, they feel the value. Because in the end, journalism can only ever be successful if the people who consume it, when they've consumed it, think, thank goodness I did. And so to some extent, our products, our work, stands or falls by the quality of it, but we can't rest on the fact that, you know, Channel 4's got a very established news brand. BBC's got, you know, everyone here is representing very established news brands, which on one level gives us a head start, but I don't think it gives us as much of a head start in the digital space as perhaps some people think.
Just quick, I'm curious. Sorry, I can't see you, but I am curious as to whether part of the problem is that if you're a philanthropist, you want to give money to an institution that is perhaps advocating for something that you believe in. So, for example, an NGO that had a newsroom that was focused on, you know, climate change or diversity or, you know, whatever else, you know, might get the philanthropist's money directly, and that organization might say that it's you know, reporting the news. But it's reporting through sort of an advocacy point of view. Maybe philanthropists feel that going to a more sort of neutral news organization, they don't get their money straight to where they want it. I wonder whether that's the problem. And so it's the difference between and so the money will never come to even a small news organization that claims not to have an agenda.
There will be more questions, and if there aren't, I'll start spearfishing. I'm already looking at Google, but we want to make it in a number of different voices, so please share your questions or thoughts. We have a question here on the left.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Daniel from Carbon Brief. We focus on climate change communications, and I just wanted to kind of ask anyone on the panel really how you're prioritizing climate change across your coverage. Obviously, it is a really important issue, but how are you doing that? And secondly, how are you aiming to do that in a way that doesn't disengage people?
Do I have a volunteer on the panel to take this one?
On merit, I would say. I mean, there were different times, obviously, the build-up to COP26 in this country obviously saw huge amounts of climate change coverage across all news channels, and that sort of fell off a cliff as soon as COP was over. So you're probably finding it very hard to get your stories onto the news at the moment. But I mean, climate change is a big priority for many of our viewers, and we assess all the stories on merit. And the challenge with it is obviously new ways to tell the story and new ways to look at it, and that is a perpetual challenge, because you often end up back at the same debating point for us. But it's fighting.
I don't know if you find this, Krishnan, but one of the things we definitely wrestle with climate change is it doesn't offer up pegs for stories as often as, say, politics does. So it's this enormous issue, obviously, that is evolving relatively slowly in news terms. And so because we tend to work in daily cycles, don't we? You come in and you go, right, what are the stories today? Climate change doesn't always generate the pegs as obviously as politics and other types of stories. I'm not saying that's not a reason to cover it, but I think that's one of the challenges within all of our editorial discussions is, why is today the day to go hard at climate change rather than tomorrow or the next day?
We're covering it. We're doing a lot of coverage on energy transition, because we have many, we're very strong in that sphere, covering sort of energy, commodities. Sorry, all the questions seem to be coming here, so I still can't see you. And so in that sense, there was a peg every day, because there is a story every day about a company, big or small, or a financial result, that speaks to this issue. The way we are trying to approach it, and again, that's because we have perhaps a difference between us and as a newsroom and the others here, is we do have a very large part of our newsroom writes about covers business, and so really, what corporations are doing, what the market is doing, you can cover climate change every day as a result of it. But I would also add that one of our most popular areas of coverage, particularly with our clients, is we have a visual team doing climate change solutions, in particular solutions journalism. And I think visual stories that show, in particular, what people are doing on the ground around the world on climate issues proves particularly popular across all our client sets and the public at large.
But I do think, though, that on that whole news avoidance topic, I think climate crisis is one area where there is news avoidance, chiefly because it just feels such a huge topic, and what can people do and how can they actually impact change, which leads to that whole kind of climate anxiety thing. But also, I think to Ross's point, it's a story that's not, although it is moving very quickly, that you don't get those bits of drama in it, I think, which is, obviously, if we're being honest about news is quite often moments of high drama. So we've again, the way how we've tried to do that is by trying to show the human side, by telling real people's stories. But again, there's only so many times we can keep going back to people whose houses are about to slip into the sea off the Suffolk coast, but we'll try and do those. But then there's little things that we do. So we've changed how we do our weather panel. So we'll now have the weather, but we'll also put that in a wider context of climate crisis. So it's little things and feeding into your daily, but making it relevant to people's lives. But it is a challenge. I know broadcasters have really found that.
I want to be sort of respectful of people's time, and I think we have promised the panelists in particular that we would wrap this up 11:15. It is now 11:15. So you've had facts, you've had analysis, you've had personality. You might even have had one or two opinions. I can't possibly comment on that. And now I hope that you will all, throw yourself into the great conversation around the Digital News Report, the 2022 edition. And I'm also very pleased to share already now that Alessandra has already invited us to come back in 2023, where I hope you will be right back in this room to hear Nic Newman represent and present the 2023 Digital News Report. But before you do that, read this year's report, join the conversation online, and thanks so much for coming out today, and thanks to our panelists as you know.